Please welcome Dr. Judy Melinek and TJ Mitchell.
Thank you.
Hi, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do as a forensic pathologist. I investigate cases of violent, sudden, or unusual deaths. According to California law, that includes even deaths that have been unattended by a physician in the last 20 days before the person dies. Any death related to an accident or injury, either old or recent, and you'll notice how broad that is in the law. But what it does is it captures a large group of cases, and then we investigate them further depending on the necessity. Any death that's homicide, suicide, or accidental, or any death due to a criminal act. Now, the basics of an autopsy examination, and I'm not going to show you any yucky pictures, I promise, are we start off with an external examination where we look at the outside of the body for signs of disease or injury that can explain why the person died. And then we go inside, we remove the organs, and we take specimens for additional testing. And those specimens can be things like blood, DNA. We can also collect urine, the fluid behind the eye, which is the vitreous, and all of that can be sent to the lab to do additional analysis if necessary. And everything is documented. It's documented in our diagrams, in our photographs, and in our autopsy report. So the questions the medical examiner answers in cases, all cases, not just cases of a homicide, are first of all, we have to figure out who the dead body is. Who are you? And the number one way we identify people is actually by visual identification. That somebody will say, oh, that's my Uncle George, and this is his legal name, and we just rely on that. But we can also use scientific modalities such as fingerprints, x-rays, or DNA in order to scientifically identify someone, especially if visual identification is not going to be reliable. The next thing we need to figure out is why did you die? And that's the cause of death. And that's where our expertise and training as physicians, as pathologists, come into play. But more than that, we have to be investigators, and that's where the manner of death plays in order to figure out whether the death is natural due to disease, or whether it's due to injury. And if it's due to injury, is that injury an accident? Is it a homicide? Is it a suicide? Or can we not tell based on the scientific evidence? And that's when we say undetermined. That's when we as scientists have to have the integrity to say, you know what, I can't figure this out, and that's what undetermined is for. And then even in cases where we know something is a homicide, we are charged with collecting evidence. So in this photo you'll see on the right, there's actually a shoe that came off a deceased individual, and he stepped in something, and you can see that it's stuck in the sole. So even trace evidence, things that are in the clothing or hairs that are caught in the hand, those might have implications at some later point, and we have to be able to recognize that evidence and collect it. Because even if the case appears to be a suicide, it may not be. And even if the case appears to be a homicide, it may not be, and that evidence might be crucial at a later time. So the body itself, when we look at a dead body, that body is evidence itself. And the wounds on the body, the wounds we document, are evidence. They're types of wounds, whether they're blunt trauma or sharp trauma, as you see on the right, the gunshot wound that you see on the left, whether the location of the body and the location of those wounds on the body indicate how what went down happened, how it happened, and the pattern of those injuries, whether they're defensive injuries, as you see in the up top corner, that would indicate that there was a struggle. So a good medical examiner, an ethical medical examiner, reviews all the data that's available before coming to a final determination. And when things don't add up, when you get a story that doesn't match up with a body, you have to do additional investigation. When it doesn't make sense, that's the point where you don't just stop and give up. You have to ask more questions. You have to get more medical records. You have to do more testing. And a good medical examiner keeps an open mind and remains objective before deciding on the cause or the manner of death. Now, all this is important because we're the ones who get called to testify in court. And we are called as expert witnesses, and there are differences between fact witnesses, the people who witness the crime occur. They can testify to just the facts, what they saw and what they heard, but they're not allowed to rely on hearsay, what somebody else told them. But an expert witness is qualified So we actually recite our CV, our curriculum vitae, when we testify. And we say, this is my experience, and this is my training, and this is everything that I learned. And a judge declares us qualified in front of the jury. And then, because of that, because of our expertise and our training, we're allowed to use hearsay. We can rely on medical records that were collected by other physicians. We can rely on witness statements. If a family member calls me up and tells me about a decedent's drug use or drug history, I can rely on that. That's hearsay. But I'm an expert, so I'm allowed to rely on it. And I can also give opinions. I don't just testify in court that there was a hole in the body. I testify that that hole was a gunshot wound or a stab wound. So when a forensic pathologist acts as an expert, it's really important that they retain their ethics. And an ethical expert has to have an open door policy for law enforcement, for the DA's office, for the public defender, and for even civil attorneys. You have to be able to have an open door policy and answer their questions. And an ethical expert also conducts an independent investigation. So the police can tell you a story, but if it doesn't match up, then you call up the witnesses. You can call up the family yourself as a medical examiner. You have the authority and the right to do that. And an ethical expert also resists political pressure. And this is not unusual, that sometimes we'll get pushback from family members who don't want the case to be signed out as a suicide because they will lose insurance money, or that they don't want the case where law enforcement restrained an individual to be called a homicide because then there'll be a lawsuit or there'll be something in the press that will embarrass the politicians. That is not unheard of. But an effective expert does more than just answer the questions of the people who come into their office. An effective expert reaches out, does research, educates the public, asks and writes questions for people who need to educate the public, whether they're teachers or journalists or attorneys, and also creates exhibits for court that can be used to demonstrate these things. Now, with regards to scientific integrity and independence, the National Academy of Sciences actually issued a report in 2009 that was highly critical of forensic sciences in the United States and specifically attacked certain expertise, such as hair and fiber analysis and dental bite mark analysis, as not being up to snuff to the level of, let's say, DNA analysis, which has very accurate and reproducible results and good statistics in the medical literature. And in my own research, I surveyed professionals in my field at the National Association of Medical Examiners and discovered the following. 24% said that they were considered prosecution witnesses within their jurisdiction. Almost half, 42%, were expected to share defense information with the district attorney's office. 5.6% said that they were retaliated against if they did not comply with this, and over half, 64%, had limitations imposed on their outside consult work. So if you're working as a scientist in this field and you're working for the government and you've got limitations on your outside consult work, that means that there are fewer experts of your caliber available for defense attorneys or for exonerations. So as a result of these findings, I authored the NAME Medical Examiner Independence Position Paper. And we wrote this paper specifically saying that experts need to be independent and free of political influence. Now, this movie talks about an exoneration, and I want to tell you a little bit about the Innocence Project, which is co-hosting this event. It was founded in 1992 in New York, and it was done at the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. And to date, 325 people have been exonerated by DNA evidence. 1 in 4 are from false confessions. They account for 25% of the exonerations. So the question is, why do people falsely confess? And I think there's a general acceptance of the population. Why would anybody confess to something they didn't do? It's got to be true because nobody would do something against their self-interest. That's the common knowledge. That's what people commonly think. But really, people will falsely confess when they're under duress, when they're coerced, if they're intoxicated or mentally impaired, or they have a diminished mental capacity. Sometimes they'll confess in order to protect somebody else. And in this case, you have fear of violence or a threat of a harsh sentence. Now, the other thing that the Innocence Project does is it educates the public about not just false confessions, but also the fact that there are innocent people in prison and they need support. But they also do advocacy to make sure that there's integrity in current science as we go forward so that there are fewer false confessions. Now, I do have the honor of being able to tell you that there's actually a different ending to this movie. David McCallum was exonerated. He was really... He was not paroled. Yeah.
He did not admit that he was wrong. He didn't wave the white flag. He didn't give up. He was exonerated.
Right. And it's through the work. And it's through the work you saw here. He was released in October of 2014. They're actually redoing the ending of the movie, and the premiere is this week on the East Coast, which is why we couldn't show you the new one, because then we would compete with the premiere. But a new version of the movie is coming out with the new ending. He served 28 years, and when he was released, DA Kenneth Thompson said to the Wall Street Journal, "We should not have a national reputation as a place where people have been railroaded into confessing to crimes they did not commit."
And there he is. He's a free man today. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our book, Working Stiff, before we do a reading, and then after that, it's a brief reading, it's 6 minutes, and then after that, we will open it up to questions and answers for Dr. Melinek about the film and about being a forensic pathologist, an expert witness, and about forensics in general. The book is called Working Stiff, 2 Years, 262 Bodies, and the Making of a Medical Examiner. And it's based on a diary that Judy kept for the 2 years that she was training in New York City to become a medical examiner. She kept this diary for 2 years and then essentially handed it off to me. I'm a writer. And she said, okay, now write this. And together we collaborated. Yeah, we had 3 children. I was a full-time stay-at-home dad at the time. So 10 years later, we actually were able to collaborate and write the book. It was published in August of last year by Scribner. The book is for sale outside, and we will be signing copies after this event.
We specifically chose this reading because it highlights the role of the medical examiner in preventing wrongful convictions when the science can't prove one thing versus another. So that's why we called it. It's actually from the chapter Death at the Hand of Another, chapter 7, from the book Working Stiff. Andre Jefferson was a 22-year-old black man from the Wagner houses in East Harlem. The only witness to his death by a single gunshot wound to the left temple was a friend named Justin. Justin told the cops that he had brought Andre a handgun the two of them were planning on selling. According to Justin, Andre took the gun and aimed it out a window. "Don't do that," Justin told him. "Hey, how about this?" Andre raised the gun, pointing it at his own head, and bam! It went off. The gun was sitting on the windowsill when the police arrived. They arrested Justin trying to leave the building. Andre Jefferson had a single penetrating gunshot wound at the hairline with fine stippling on his right ear, but no soot, intermediate range. The bullet had passed through Jefferson's brain and stopped at the other side. When I lifted the brain out of the top of his head, the slug was sitting in the subdural space right up against the skull and directly opposite the entrance wound. It was small, consistent with a .22. I bagged the deformed piece of gray metal for evidence and wrote, "Small caliber unjacketed lead bullet," on my worksheet. The stippling pattern told me Andre was shot from somewhere between 6 inches and 3 feet away, which meant it was plausible he had shot himself by accident, as Justin said. Intermediate range included a distance short enough for self-infliction to be possible, and a distance long enough for it to be impossible. Of course, at any distance, it was also plausible that someone else had been holding the gun when it went off, which would make the shooting a homicide. So, who done it? I sent the police a request for a range of fire analysis of the gun and had a pleasant surprise 2.5 months later when Detective Shawn Hart of the New York City Police Laboratory Ballistics Unit invited me down to watch the ballistics test in person. I asked him if I could bring students along.
"Sure," he replied, "as many as you'd like."
This was in March 2003, and I was 8 months pregnant with our second child. I beached myself in the passenger seat of a colleague's car as we drove to Queens, with 3 lucky medical students crammed in the back. Detective Hart was a round-faced man with intense green eyes, in blue jeans and an NYPD sweatshirt. He had been on the force 17 years, the last 8 in the ballistics unit, where he made it clear he was planning to stay until retirement.
I was a beat cop at Manhattan North for a few years, then on narcotics in 2 different precincts in Queens, including this one. I bought drugs for 2 years around here.
Only way you can say that legally and not get arrested, I joked.
I was arrested once.
Really?
Yeah. I was dressed as a construction worker, you know, low jeans, hard hat, beat-up work boots. Well, the precinct did a sweep and caught me with the drugs I just bought.
Detective Shawn Hart didn't have the mien of a man who loved a tall tale, and that made the 5 of us lean in all the closer.
This patrolman was handcuffing me against his car. I started to whisper to him, "Hey, I'm a cop," because I was really nervous he would find my gun.
And shoot you? I kicked myself for blurting the question when he turned his detective's eyes on me, trepanning right into my brain.
Yeah, well, you never know. I couldn't say it too loud or I'd blow my cover. Lucky for me, the sergeant came over. He thought the patrolman was having trouble cuffing me. The sergeant recognized me from the precinct, so they got the handcuffs on, put me in the back of the car, drove a few blocks, and let me go.
Wow, said one of the medical students. What a story.
Yeah, good one to tell my kids someday.
Sitting on the table in the firing range was a black wooden box with a piece of white canvas fastened to its front end. It looked like a homemade pet carrier. A metal yardstick lay flush against the box and stretched away from it on the table. Detective Hart explained this was the firing box. What's in it, I wanted to know. He lifted up the canvas and showed us sheets of cotton batting, like you'd buy at a fabric store, packed tightly.
Here's your gun.
The detective said, opening a plastic evidence bag and lifting out an itty-bitty .22, silver with brown inlaid grip. It looked like a toy. Hart made perfectly sure we were all standing behind him and that we had our blocky ear mufflers on, and he pressed the muzzle against the canvas sheet and squeezed the trigger. The gun made a pop and barely twitched in his expert hand. It left a burnt black ring in the canvas, a tiny hole in the middle.
That's a tight trigger, I can tell you already, Hart said. Exactly how tight, I'll tell you later.
He put a fresh square of canvas onto the box, used the yardstick to line up the muzzle 2 inches away, and fired again. This time, the gun bucked a bit more. The close-range gunshot left a wide, messy starburst of dark soot and debris around the bullet hole. Detective Hart repeated this ritual slowly and methodically at 4, 6, 8, 12, 18, and 24 inches. Each time, the debris pattern on the white canvas became wider and more diffuse, until at 30 inches there was nothing on the cloth but a bullet hole. When he laid all the canvas sheets on the table, it seemed clear that the stippling pattern on Jefferson's wound had been made when that gun was fired at him from more than 12, but less than 18 inches away. I asked my medical examiner colleague his impression, and he thought the same thing. Shit, I said to myself. 12 to 18 inches was the gray area for an intermediate range gunshot wound. Far away for a self-inflicted wound, but not too far. It meant I couldn't rule out an accident and call this a homicide, which I would have been able to do if the debris spread matched the gun at 30 inches away or even 24. Next, as promised, Detective Hart tested the trigger pull. He checked the gun was empty, pointed it toward the ceiling, and suspended a 3-pound wire weight to the trigger. Nothing happened. It was too light. He went up to 4 pounds, then 5. Still no click. He kept adding weight. By the time the detective finally tripped the pistol's trigger, he had 11¼ pounds loaded onto the end of the wire balance.
That's sure no hair trigger, he told us. Most street guns measure out at 5 to 7 pounds. This trigger is closer to the pull required on service weapons by the NYPD. You've got to squeeze it like you mean it.
Fascinating as it was, Detective Hart's ballistics demonstration didn't solve the Jefferson case. I still had to figure out who put a bullet into Andre's brain with that little silver .22. I knew the gun was fired from 12 to 18 inches away, and it didn't have a hair trigger, but the only thing this established was that it was not impossible for the wound to be self-inflicted. I suspected Justin was trying to get the gun away from Andre when it went off by accident at the far end of Andre's reach. Maybe it was still in Andre's hand, maybe in the grip of both of them at once. Or maybe Justin shot Andre over drugs, over a girl, over something else. As Dr. Hirsch reminded me when I presented this dispiriting amalgam of what-ifs at 3 o'clock rounds, he who accuses must prove, and I couldn't prove a damn thing. Andre Jefferson's shooting was filed as an undetermined manner of death.
Okay, so to start the questions going, I have one for you, Judy, actually, that was raised by the movie. David, in his false confession, says that after they shot the guy in the park, he was waving his arms around. Is that possible?
It depends what you mean by waving. So if it was just seizure activity, which can occur after a headshot wound and he was twitching, it would be one thing. But waving them around sounds inconsistent with a gunshot wound to the head. And then you also have the inconsistencies between his testimony, which is a single gunshot wound, and Stuckey's testimony that it was more than one, I think it was 2 or 3. So that's one of the roles that a medical examiner can play in looking at these kind of cases. And in fact, I've worked for public defenders here in San Francisco, as well as in other counties, looking at situations where there's a confession and where the confession is not consistent with the physical findings in order to show to the jury that it was coerced because it's not consistent with what we're seeing in terms of the evidence.
the body doesn't lie is one of the things that Dr. Hirsch, who we mentioned in the reading, Dr. Charles Hirsch was Judy's mentor, the chief medical examiner of New York City for a great many years.
Okay, so at this point, I think there are going to be microphones in the audience, so if anybody has a question, just raise your hand and they'll bring a microphone over to you.
Janet,
so
go
we can
first.
all hear it.
Thank you. I'd like to add a little bullet to that one slide that talked about reasons for confessions. There's one thing called a plea bargain, which is a form of uncoerced confession. But getting onto the subject of the evening, very fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I have a quick question, 2 parts. I'm sure you watch the TV CSI. When you look at those wonderful programmers, what things do you enjoy seeing the most and do you think are realistic? And then what things drive you absolutely crazy?
We can't watch those shows. Yes. Whenever I turn one of those shows on, she starts yelling at the television. I have to turn it off.
So I actually wrote a blog post about this. So if you Google 7 CSI fails, I have the 7 top things that drive me crazy about CSI. The number 1 is that they're constantly in the dark. So they have them in the laboratory and it's pitch black and they're shining a flashlight on a specimen where all of our examinations are actually done under bright lights like in a surgical suite, because if you can't see the evidence, you can't collect the evidence. So that's my number 1 pet peeve. The other issue that CSI does is it gives an expectation that somehow there's going to be scientific evidence in every single case. And people don't seem to understand, and jurors don't seem to understand, that sometimes all the evidence is just people's testimony and just people's word, and they have to judge whether someone is lying or not, or misguided or not, or mistaken or not, just based on their words without any scientific evidence whatsoever. And that's very frustrating for juries because the expectation is that the scientist is going to get on the stand and tell them the answer. The other thing that's a real problem for me when I testify is this expectation that juries have that I'm going to wrap up the whole case and point to the killer and said he did it in the living room with the candlestick, I mean just like Clue. And that's not how it works. Sometimes you will have a prosecution theory that's consistent with the physical evidence, and then the defense will present their case, and the defense circumstances and theory are also consistent with the physical evidence. Sometimes the physical evidence can't tell you who's right. And I've had situations where I've testified for both the prosecution and then subsequently for the defense in the same case, and the jurors were upset at the end that I didn't tell them what the answer was, when really it's up to them to make the decision. That's not my decision.
Another problem with these shows is everything you see is a murder.
Yeah.
And about
That's
10%
right.
of what Judy autopsies is a murder.
So in a given year, I'll do about 250 autopsies, and only about 20 of them will be homicides. The majority are natural deaths, accidents, suicides. And in Working Stiff, we highlight those cases as well to give people an idea that there's a lot more to what medical examiners do than just solving crimes. Next question. Do we have a mic? Okay. There we go. Thank you.
Is it on? Yeah. I'm curious, since we didn't get to see the new version with the ending, I want to know how you got David released.
Oh, I was not involved.
And
in
I'm
David's
so
case.
happy
Yeah.
about how
It
that
is.
ended.
Yeah. Sorry, say again? My understanding is, with regards to the release, is that it was primarily based on the subsequent appeal that they mentioned at the last part of the movie, and it specifically addressed this issue of the false confession and the fact that the additional evidence that was brought forth in the film about the DNA and the other witnesses who weren't necessarily cooperating, but some of the information they got was what brought them forth. I was not involved in his exoneration. I've been involved in others, but not in this one. Is there a microphone? Another question? I'm leaving it up to you. You got to give them the microphone, otherwise I can't hear them.
Hi. One of the key, well, not turning points in the movie, but they addressed the testing of the DNA on the cigarette. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you can't test for now that either A, you wish you could test for, or you foresee being able to test for in 15, 20 years?
I think that the one thing that we really have a difficult time with is estimating time of death. Because a lot of times somebody will die and then the medical examiner will come out to the scene. And again, on television, it seems like we can tell, oh, they died between 9:30 and 10. And the reality is we can't accurately predict time of death that well. The medical literature is not that good at it, and it's highly dependent on body temperature and on the ambient temperature. So if we could come up with some sort of test that was independent of temperature, some sort of apoptosis gene that breaks down, or some sort of marker for cellular or tissue breakdown that can give us an accurate determination of time of death regardless of the environment, that would be a real find. That would be a real discovery in forensics that we don't have right now.
Let me mention something too having to do with the September 11th identification of remains. That's one of the subjects that we deal with in the book, because when Judy started work in New York City, that was in July of 2001. So she is one of the 30 medical examiners who identified the remains after September 11th. After they were done identifying them through forensics means, those remains went to DNA analysis, which takes a very long time, is very expensive, and was still ongoing. What the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner is contemplating doing now, I think is very exciting, is using proteins instead of DNA. DNA breaks down under heat and under other conditions. Proteins do not. So they're trying to figure out unique proteins to individuals that they can then test for, which is a new area of investigation.
So there's a lot of potential emerging fields in forensics. Unfortunately, forensic sciences as a field is not funded as much as, let's say, cancer research or other types of research, and there are also restrictions on our ability to experiment. We're not allowed to experiment on dead bodies. Our job as medical examiners is to just determine the cause and the manner of death. So unless we have bodies that are donated to science specifically for forensic investigation, that limits our ability. So that's something that you can contribute to if you're interested in that as well. So next question.
I have a DNA question,
Sure.
and it's medical. And some years ago, I read, and it was related medically in terms of things they found in people. I think it was when they were going to do a transplant of an organ. That some of us have a little cluster of DNA that is totally different than the 99% of the DNA in our bodies. And it's not, I don't think they know how many of us have that kind of thing. And I wondered if you've run into that kind of thing, how often, and I suppose it could have some implication in criminal trials too, but it medically had an implication. Have you heard,
I've heard of that research. In terms of how it applies on a daily basis, to me, it's very little. I mean, ultimately, what my job is to collect the samples that could potentially be used for DNA analysis. So if I have a case where someone died of a disease that I suspect might be genetic, then I need to take the requisite testing and then we send it to a lab for DNA analysis. And the same thing comes for identifications. I just have to be aware of what's there in order to do the proper collection of specimens. But I don't do DNA analysis myself.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I would like to know if David received any compensation for the 28 years he was falsely imprisoned, number one, and if he did, can you tell us how much? And I would also like to make a suggestion to all of you in the audience. If you have a few extra dollars that you want to put some wonderful place, consider the Northern California Innocence Project. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Yeah. So actually, Paige, why don't you come on up for a second? Say a few words. So Paige is with the Northern California Innocence Project. I've worked with her in a few cases. She's been responsible for exonerating some people who have been wrongfully convicted, and she's going to be in the front as well to answer questions and also to collect donations if you're interested in donating to this organization.
But I don't believe we know anything
Yeah,
about whether David's been compensated.
I don't think he's been compensated, and I think Paige can actually comment on.
Usually it takes a long time. Like in California, mostly you're waiting at least 5 years before you get anything, and even then it's very rare. So you also should help out exonerees in addition to the Innocence Project.
No, there are laws that are and there's advocacy that's being put in place in order to try to allow people to get some money back, because again, the hurdles are still there in terms of their ability to function in society after they're released after so many years. So, so that there are laws that are being passed, and if you educate yourself on them, it would be great to have your support in that.
And your financial support of the Innocence Project is important because DNA is expensive.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that in order to hire the attorneys and hire the experts and get all that work done, that's where they need funding and they need support.
Just a quick question. How do you deal with it emotionally? I mean, I've seen one autopsy while I was in school, and yeah, it's pretty intense.
I got to say that that's something that I actually cover in the book, and I talk about the fact that my first exposure to a dead body is shocking. The first time I ever saw a dead body in medical school. And then you start to realize that medical training is a desensitization process to some degree. So you start with your first cadaver when you're in anatomy, and then you examine people in a clinic, and you get used to seeing and objectifying your patients in order to be able to do your job. Now, that doesn't mean you lose touch of your emotions. In fact, you need that empathetic connection in order to connect with the families of the deceased, because they're the ones who are going to call me up and ask me what happened, and I need to be able to empathize with them and understand where they're coming from in order to communicate effectively. But it is something that comes with training, and all medical professionals go through it. And in some ways, I say it's easier for me because a dead body really is an object to some degree. I mean, the soul is gone, is the way I think of it. And really, it's my job to focus on what's left, that shell, because that's the evidence. And that's there are people waiting for those answers. And those people loved this person. And they're the ones that I do it for. I do it for them.
It can be harder to be a clinician who says, you got to lose weight, you got to stop smoking, I'm telling you this every year, you got to do it, and then your patient dies, you know? Judy, when her patients come to her, their suffering is already over. And she's really in it for the families and for the survivors.
Yeah.
Judy, you're a beautiful, feminine woman. I am intrigued. How did you get interested in this? Did you know what you were beginning to study, or did you fall in one direction and you just couldn't stop, or whatever?
Well, after her modeling career.
Thank you, honey. He's so generous. I actually started off in surgery. So I liked working with my hands and I liked fixing things, but the hours were so grueling, and it was 130 hours a week. It was every other night on call, and I was just physically exhausted. So actually in the book I talk about how physically exhausting that specific residency was, and I dropped out to go into pathology thinking, oh, at least they'll have better hours, they'll still be dead tomorrow, you know? But I didn't have the passion for it that I
She
had.
didn't make that up. One of the other residents told her that.
No,
One of her
they'll still be
first
dead
days.
tomorrow.
There's no rush.
We were going
They'll
to put
still be
that
dead
on our
tomorrow.
sweatshirts, actually. But I mean, ultimately, what I realized when I went into pathology is that when you work in pathology in the hospital, you're working in the laboratory. You don't get to see patients on a regular basis. So you have this disconnect with, you don't feel like a real doctor anymore. And it was only when I did my forensics rotation where I got to go out to crime scenes and talk to the police and help grieving relatives find out what happened. I felt like a doctor again. I felt like I was connected to people. So it really brought me to the right field. It just took it was a circuitous path, but I found it.
Sasan there.
Yeah.
Marin County used to be served by a voted-in coroner, and then back in 2010, I believe, it got combined with the sheriff's office, so we have a sheriff-coroner system in order to save money. Do you think that was a very good choice? Thank you.
I can't speak to specifically Marin as opposed to any other system. What I can say is that the National Academy of Sciences specifically criticized law enforcement being in charge of death investigation because of this perception of conflict of interest, especially when you're dealing with officer-involved incidents. So if somebody dies in the jail and the sheriff owns the jail, there's going to be a perception of a conflict. Whether that conflict is real or not, we can tackle that later, but ultimately there's this perception that, well, the sheriff owns the jail and the sheriff owns the pathologist, so he's going to just say whatever the sheriff wants him to say. Whether he's independent or not, he might be the most independent person in the world, but the perception is there that there's a conflict of interest. And I know from my own experiences, and I write about it in Working Stiff, that there were cases that I experienced in my first year of training where the police had a certain idea about what the case was, and the physical body did not match up to what they were telling me. And I said, go out, please investigate this. And they were resistant. And
yeah, we have a few of those
we
in
have
the
a
book.
few, but,
Yeah.
but really the ratio is, at a certain point we started to get worried, like, were we misrepresenting the police? But then we counted them, and the majority of interactions I have with the police, both in the book and in real life, are actually very positive. They're very professional. They want to solve the crime. They want to know what really happened. They want to do the right thing and get the right guy. But then there are a few outliers who are a little lazy or not interested or whatever their issue, and they tend to color people's perception of the entire police force. And in my experience, having an independent office where I had independent investigators and being able to call and pursue things, and that was part of my job description there, was a boon, was a real advantage. But if the police don't want to investigate something, it'll get filed as undetermined. And that's where some of those cases end up. There were times that I would call things a homicide, and if they don't have a suspect, then they don't know where to go with that. Like, they're perfectly happy to go out and arrest somebody if they have a suspect and I call it a homicide. But if I call it a homicide and they have no clue who did it, then it's much more frustrating, and it ends up being another unsolved case on their roster.
Yeah, this is something that gets misapprehended all the time. Just because a medical examiner calls it a homicide doesn't mean it's going to go to court and anybody's going to get charged with it.
Yeah.
Homicide is one of the manners of death. It's one of the definitions. But after that, it's out of Judy's hands. It's in the hands of the DA.
And there are many cases where I might call something a homicide, but the DA doesn't have any reliable witnesses and they won't press charges. Or they will plea bargain, as another audience member had mentioned, and I'll never even go to court. I'll never even hear what the outcome is. Do we have?
This will be the last question.
Okay, so we have one more question, and then we'll be outside signing books. So if you have questions as you line up for books, I'll be more than happy to take them there too.
Well, I have a medical question. You had mentioned about collecting fluids earlier.
Mm-hmm.
What do you collect from the vitreous of the eye?
Okay. So the clear fluid that composes the substance of our eyeball is a really good specimen for glucose, for sugar, because we can't measure blood sugar after death. Blood is not good for blood sugar, especially if bacteria get into it. They eat up all the sugar and you can't measure it. But the clear fluid is protected, and bacteria don't get in there as quickly or as easily. So if somebody's diabetic and their blood sugar is high, I can't measure it in the blood after death, but I can measure it in the vitreous. The other thing it's really good for is dehydration. So the electrolytes, the sodium, potassium, chloride, their levels will change during life, and that will be reflected in the vitreous for a period of time. Now, once the body starts to decompose, then it becomes more difficult to interpret. And if the body's really decomposed, the fluid dries up and there's nothing there. So dehydration is one of those things that's much easier to diagnose in a fresh body than it is in a decomposed body. The decomposition process starts at the moment we die. A lot of it depends on the ambient temperature. So I even had a case when I was working in San Francisco when a guy had died, and the investigators called me because he was found in the morning sitting on his sofa, and he was already starting to decompose. His belly was turning green. He had, starting to change color on his face. His fingers were getting dry. And the roommate had said that he was awake and alive the night before. And the roommate was a drug user, so our investigator was concerned that the guy was just lying to him and wasn't reliable. But it was San Francisco, and it was August, so it was freezing cold. And as I said, where is he seated in the room? And he said, oh, he's seated on the sofa. And I said, where's the heater? He goes, oh, it's right next to him. I said, could you ask the roommate if the heater was on last night? And sure enough, it was, and it was blowing on him all night long. So he had basically started to decompose overnight. So that's why you need to have a good scene investigation, because it really depends on the scene and the circumstances of that individual case.
So we'll be happy to take more questions out in the lobby while we're signing books.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to everybody here at the Rayfield Film Center, and thank you to Copperfield Books for coming out too.